The morning of December 14th, 1991, didn't feel like a day that would end in a city-wide vigil. In Federal Way, Washington, it was just another bone-chilling Saturday, the kind of morning where the Pacific Northwest fog clings to the trees like a damp shroud, and the air is so heavy you can almost taste the salt from the nearby Sound. At Federal Way High School, the campus was a ghost town, an expanse of grey concrete and frozen mud puddles that looked like jagged glass under the dim morning light. For 13-year-old Drew Miller and his 12-year-old friend, the biting cold was just an obstacle to overcome. They had spent the night at Drew's house, fueled by cartoons and bowls of cereal, before grabbing their skateboards and heading out into the frost. Drew lived just a 2-minute walk from the school, and for boys their age, the campus wasn't just a place of learning, it was their playground, a labyrinth of stairs and railings to conquer. As they cut through a familiar trail near the tennis courts, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic crack-pop of their sneakers, smashing the ice in the mud puddles a sound. Drew later compared to shattering windows in a quiet room. They were headed toward a shortcut, weaving through the overgrown brush that lined the embankment near the north parking lot. The bushes were shoulder-high, a wall of tangled green and brown that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Then the world stopped. Just a few feet away, the brush exploded with movement. A man abruptly stood up from the center of the thicket. He didn't scramble. He didn't apologize for trespassing. He simply stood there, a tall figure in a dark trench coat, and stared. The boys froze. It was a jarring, out-of-place sight for 9 in the morning on a deserted campus. But it wasn't just the man's presence that sent a jolt of ice through Drew's veins, it was his eyes. Drew would later describe them as evil, a look so predatory and detached that it became frozen in his mind as the embodiment of a legitimate boogeyman. The man didn't say a word. He eventually stepped out of the brush and began walking quickly toward the parking lot, his head down, moving with the urgent pace of someone who had just finished a terrible task. The boys, trying to shake off the creepy feeling, assumed they'd just interrupted a local vagrant or someone doing something minor. They waited a beat, then let curiosity pull them toward the spot where the man had been crouching. They expected to find a hidden fort or discarded trash. Instead, they found a nightmare. Lying motionless on her back in the dirt was 16-year-old Sara Yarborough. She was a vision of innocence that had been violently collided with by a monster. She was still wearing her vibrant drill team uniform, a sweater and skirt that were now a tragic contrast to the grey mud. Her other items of clothing, her jacket and undergarments, had been removed and placed in a neat, purposeful pile, just 3 feet from her body, a detail that signaled a level of calculation that was pure, unadulterated evil. But the detail that would break the hearts of everyone who saw the scene, those hot curlers. Sara had left her home an hour early that morning, her hair still set in curlers because she was so dedicated to her team and their upcoming competition. They were still there, tucked into her ponytail, a silent witness to a morning routine that should have ended with a trophy, not a crime scene. As the shock began to settle, Drew looked up and realized the man was still there. He had stopped at the edge of the parking lot and turned around, staring back at the 2 boys who were now standing over his victim. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were looking at a killer, and he was looking at them. Panic, raw and electric, took over. The boys turned and ran as fast as their legs could carry them, racing back to Drew's house to tell his family. Within minutes, the sirens began to wail across Federal Way, but by then, the man in the trench coat was already a ghost. He had vanished into the suburbia he had just terrorized, leaving behind a 16-year-old girl whose future was stolen before she ever got to take the curlers out of her hair. The innocence of Federal Way was gone, and for Drew Miller, the boogeyman was no longer a myth. He was the man whose eyes would haunt him for the next 32 years. The sirens that screamed across the Federal Way High School campus that morning didn't just signal a crime scene. They announced the end of an era. Before December 14, 1991, this was a place where people left their front doors unlocked and their garage doors open. It was a community where 16-year-old girls could arrive at school an hour early without a second thought. But the moment the police tape went up near the tennis courts, that world vanished. The town woke up to a reality they weren't prepared for. A predator was walking among them, and he knew the layout of their school better than some of the students did. Detective Scott Strathy was one of the first to arrive, and he later described the scene as something that stayed with him for his entire career. He talked about the innocent nature of Sara, still in that drill team uniform, her life stolen in a way he called pure, unadulterated evil. The King County Sheriff's Office didn't just open a file, they launched a war. It was all hands on deck from the first hour. They had everything an investigator dreams of: a full male DNA profile from the semen found on Sara's clothes, 2 eyewitnesses who had looked the man in the eyes, and a detailed physical description. On paper, this case should have been closed before the new year. But the man in the trench coat seemed to have walked out of the bushes and straight into a void. The task force, led by veteran homicide investigator Jim Doyen, a man who had already spent years hunting the Green River Killer, began a relentless grind. Sara's grandfather even stepped in, facilitating the donation of a state-of-the-art computer system to help the police manage the mountain of evidence. They needed it. Within months, 4,000 tips had flooded the office. Detectives were chasing down every white Chevrolet Nova seen in the area, interviewing every local sex offender, and swabbing hundreds of men for DNA samples. Every time a new sample went to the lab, scientist Jody Sass would rush the results, hoping this was the one that would finally provide a name. Each time, the result was the same: no match. While the police were buried in paperwork, the hallways of Federal Way High School were thick with a different kind of tension. The Monday after the murder was described by teacher Bill Harris as the hardest day of his entire life. He had to walk into his classroom and physically rearrange the desks because he couldn't bear to look at the vacant spot where Sara should have been sitting. Another teacher, Ingrid Leiden, remembered Sara as the girl who was always running into chemistry class just as the bell rang, flashing a megawatt smile that usually got her out of a tardy slip. That seat was now a permanent reminder of a stolen future. The student body responded with a mixture of grief and guardedness. The sense of safety was gone. A new system was born out of necessity. Members of the school's football and wrestling teams began acting as bodyguards, developing a formal escort program to ensure no girl walked to her car alone before or after school. It was a heavy, somber shift for a group of teenagers who should have been worrying about exams and winter formal. Instead, they were scanning the parking lots for a man who matched the sketch on the news. That sketch was everywhere. It was posted in shop windows, taped to telephone poles, and featured in every local broadcast. For 13-year-old Drew Miller, the boy who found Sara, that sketch was a weight he carried every single day. The police kept coming back to him and his friend, asking for more details, more clarity. Drew later admitted he felt unimaginable pressure, as if the entire resolution of the case rested on his young shoulders. He felt like he was the only person who could help solve it, a burden that no 13-year-old is equipped to handle. He would walk past those posters and see the face of the man who had stared at him from the bushes, wondering if the boogeyman was watching him back. As the months turned into years, the investigation hit a wall that technology wasn't yet high enough to climb. In the early 90s, the national DNA database known as CODIS was just a concept. When it finally became a reality in the late 90s, Sara's case was one of the first entered. The investigators were certain that a hit was coming. A predator this violent, they reasoned, wouldn't just stop. He would be arrested for something else. His DNA would be taken, and the system would alert them. But year after year, the screen remained blank. The killer was either staying under the radar, or he was effectively navigating the loopholes of a legal system that hadn't yet realized how to use the power of the blood. Sara's family waited nearly 3 decades for a name. It is almost impossible to grasp the endurance it takes to live 10,000 days with a wound that refuses to scar over. If you appreciate the dedication of the investigators who refused to let Sara's file gather dust, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. Your interaction helps the algorithm share Sara's story with more people, ensuring she is never forgotten. The most frustrating part of this timeline is what we now know about the year 2005. That year, the suspect's older brother, Edward Peter Nicholas Jr., was arrested for an offense that required his DNA to be entered into CODIS. If Washington State had utilized familial searching at that time, a process where the system looks for close relatives of a crime scene profile, search would have pointed directly to the Nicholas family. Investigators would have seen that the DNA from Sara's clothes was a near-perfect match to Edward's sibling. But the state's crime labs were overwhelmed with backlogs and legal debates, and that specific tool was kept on the back burner. A breakthrough was sitting in a computer 16 years before an arrest was finally made, but the law wouldn't allow the detectives to see it. For Andrew Yarborough, Sara's younger brother, the silence of the investigation was punctuated by the constant sight of his sister's face on the news whenever an anniversary came around. He was only 11 when he heard his father's voice break over the phone with the news of her death. He grew up in a house where the grief was a silent third sibling. The family eventually moved away, but they could never leave the mystery behind. They were stuck in 1991, waiting for a bell to ring or a door to open. By the time the 2010s arrived, the case had officially become a cold-hit project. The original detectives were retiring, handing over the thick, worn files to a new generation. These new investigators, like Kathy Decker and Tom Jensen, were starting to look beyond the criminal databases. They were starting to realize that if the killer wasn't in their system, they would have to find him in a different one. They were about to turn to the world of genealogy, a move that would eventually link a high school murder in Washington to a family tree that began on the deck of the Mayflower. But for now, the boogeyman was still out there, living a quiet life in a town just 30 minutes away. He was working, eating, and breathing the same Pacific Northwest air as the family he had destroyed, convinced that he had committed the perfect crime. By 2011, the case of Sara Yarborough was less an active investigation and more of a ghost that lived in the back of the King County Sheriff's Office. 2 decades had passed. The folders were yellowed, the edges curled by the hands of dozens of detectives who had tried and failed to find a match. But then, a phone call was made that would effectively invent a new way to hunt for the lost. Detectives reached out to Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a pioneer in a field that didn't even have a formal name yet: forensic genetic genealogy. This was the first time that anyone had considered looking beyond the walls of law enforcement to the world of recreational DNA. The strategy was as ambitious as it was experimental. Dr. Fitzpatrick didn't start with the criminal databases that had failed the team for 20 years. Instead, she looked at the Y chromosome, the genetic signature passed down almost unchanged from father to son for centuries. By comparing the killer's DNA to public genealogical projects, she found a hit that seemed like something out of a historical novel. The killer's profile was an unmistakable match to the Fuller YSTR surname project. This wasn't just a lead, it was a map through time. The participants in this project were all descendants of a man named Robert Fuller, who had left England and settled in Salem, Massachusetts in 1630. The science was telling the detectives that the person who stood in the bushes at Federal Way High School was a relative of the very people who had arrived on the Mayflower. Suddenly, the investigation wasn't just about looking for a man in his 20s, it was about tracing a family tree that had been growing in American soil for nearly 400 years. The room at the sheriff's office was electrified. For the first time in 20 years, they had a name: Fuller. But as the excitement settled, a heavy, unsettling realization began to dawn on the team. They started looking for any Fullers who lived in the Federal Way area in 1991. One name stood out above all others, and it was a name that made the detectives' hearts sink: William Fuller. William Fuller wasn't just a local resident. He was a long-time, trusted friend of the Yarborough family. His daughter, Elizabeth, had been in the same classes as Sara. He was a man who had been a shoulder for Sara's parents to lean on during their darkest hours. He had even helped spearhead the efforts to build a memorial bench for Sara on the school campus. To think that the killer could have been sitting at the Yarborough's kitchen table, offering comfort while knowing exactly what he had done, was a thought too horrific to even process. The detectives had to move with extreme caution. They couldn't just arrest a family friend on a genealogical theory. They approached William Fuller, and in a testament to his character and his desire for justice, he voluntarily provided a DNA sample. The tension in the lab as they ran that test must have been unbearable. When the results came back, the investigators felt a strange mix of relief and renewed frustration. William Fuller was not the killer. However, the DNA confirmed that he was a paternal cousin of the perpetrator. They were in the right family, and they were in the right branch of the tree. But the man they were looking for was still a shadow. This is where the miracle of science met the messy reality of human history. The Fuller lead suddenly hit a brick wall. No other Fullers in the area seemed to fit the profile. The trail went cold again, and for several more years, the case sat in a state of suspended animation. It wasn't until 2014 and 2015 that a new technique called autosomal SNP testing began to emerge. Unlike the Y chromosome search, which only looked at the paternal line, SNP testing looked at hundreds of thousands of markers across the entire genome, allowing for far more precise matches across both sides of a family tree. By 2019, the tools had finally caught up to the detectives' determination. Working with public databases like GEDmatch, the genealogical team was able to identify a massive loophole that had kept the killer hidden for decades. They discovered that the suspect's biological surname didn't match his legal name. His paternal grandfather had been adopted into a family called Nicholas. The blood said Fuller, but the birth certificate said Nicholas. This revelation was the key that unlocked everything. The genealogists narrowed the search down to two brothers who were living in the Pacific Northwest, Edward Peter Nicholas Jr. and Patrick Leon Nicholas. The detectives immediately pulled the file on Edward. He was already in the CODIS system because of a prior rape conviction in the first degree, and he was a registered sex offender. They ran his profile against the 1991 evidence, and it was a flat exclusion. He was not the man from the bushes. That left only one person in the entire world who could have left that DNA on Sara's clothing: Patrick Leon Nicholas. The system had the killer's brother in the database for 14 years. If the laws had been different, if we had utilized familial searching back in 2005, Sara's family wouldn't have had to wait another 15 years for an answer. It is a heavy thought to carry. What do you think about the balance between privacy and the need for these tools? Should the state be allowed to look at your relatives to find a match? Let us know in the comments. This is a conversation we need to have. As the detectives looked into the life of Patrick Nicholas, they found a man who had lived his entire life just 30 minutes away from the scene of the crime. He was 27 years old at the time of the murder, a loner who worked at an auto parts store and relied on the bus system. Crucially, the bus route he took every day for work passed directly in front of Federal Way High School. He had been right there the whole time, watching the memorials, seeing the sketches, and perhaps even walking past the detectives who were hunting him. The miracle of the Mayflower connection had provided the map, and the adoption discovery had corrected the coordinates. The investigators now had a target, but they needed the final proof. They needed the DNA from the man himself, not a cousin or a brother. They began the high-stakes game of surveillance, following a man who had successfully evaded the law for nearly 30 years. They were no longer looking at a dusty file. They were looking at a living, breathing predator, and they were determined to ensure that this time he wouldn't slip through the cracks of history. When the genealogical trail finally led to the door of Patrick Leon Nicholas, investigators realized they weren't looking at a man who had made a single, horrific mistake. They were looking at a career predator who had been given every opportunity by the legal system to stop, and he chose to keep hunting. To understand why Sara Yarborough was in danger that morning, You have to go back to June of 1983, 8 years before the high school campus became a crime scene. A 21-year-old woman named Anne Croney was sitting on the bumper of her car at a public park near the Columbia River in Richland, Washington. It was a beautiful, clear morning, and she was just there to think. A 19-year-old man she didn't know approached her and started a casual conversation. His name was Patrick Nicholas. He seemed unremarkable at first, but as they spoke, Anne noticed his voice beginning to shake. An instinctual alarm went off in her head. She told him she had to leave and move toward her driver's side door. In an instant, the loner persona vanished. Nicholas lunged, pressing a knife to her throat. He forced her own underwear into her mouth to act as a gag and ordered her to walk toward a secluded, wooded area by the riverbank. Anne was terrified, but she was also observant. During their earlier conversation, Nicholas had mentioned something that would save her life. He admitted that he couldn't swim. As they reached the edge of the water, Anne didn't hesitate. She threw herself into the river and swam with everything she had. Nicholas stood on the shore, trapped by his own fear of the water, as he watched his victim escape. Nicholas was caught shortly after and pleaded guilty to attempted rape. While in custody, he made a statement that should have kept him behind bars for decades. He told the authorities, "I realize that I have a problem concerning raping girls. I was going to force the girl to have sex with me that day in the park, and I realize that is not right. I want help for my problem." A judge sentenced him to the maximum term of 10 years in prison. But here is the moment the system broke. Despite his history as a juvenile of raping 2 other women at knife point, Nicholas was released on parole in 1987, after serving only 3.5 years. If the system had functioned as it was designed to, if Patrick Nicholas had served even 6 of those 10 years, he would have been sitting in a prison cell on December 14, 1991. Instead, he was free. He was living only 6 miles from Federal Way High School. He was a man who didn't drive, a man who lived alone in a dilapidated building on a large, overgrown property in Covington. To get to his job at an auto parts store, he relied on a bus route, a route that stopped directly in front of the high school, where Sara Yarborough would soon arrive an hour too early. The failure to keep him incarcerated was only the first loophole Nicholas slipped through. 2 years after Sara's murder, in early 1993, Nicholas was arrested again, this time for the child molestation of his own stepdaughters. This was a moment where the modern world of forensic science almost caught him. DNA technology was emerging, and a conviction for a violent sex crime should have required his profile to be entered into the national database. But a deal was struck. Nicholas was allowed to plead the charges down to a gross misdemeanor assault, because it was categorized as a misdemeanor rather than a felony sex crime. The law at the time did not require his DNA to be collected. He walked out of that courtroom once again, a ghost in the system, his biological signature missing from the very database that was searching for him every single day. For the next 28 years, Nicholas lived a life of quiet invisibility. He stayed in the area, never moving far from the scene of his horrific crime. He kept a kitchen drawer filled with haunting mementos, including a copy of a 1994 newspaper that featured an article about Sara's murder. He even kept a photo of a cheerleader in that same drawer, a silent, unsettling tribute to the predatory urges he had admitted to having decades earlier. He was a man who watched the world from the window of a bus, passing the high school memorial bench dedicated to the girl he had destroyed, likely believing he had committed the perfect crime. In 2005, yet another opportunity to find him was missed. His older brother, Edward Peter Nicholas Jr., was arrested for a first-degree rape. Because of the severity of that crime, Edward's DNA was entered into CODIS. If Washington State had utilized a tool called familial searching, where the system looks for relatives of a crime scene profile, the computer would have immediately flagged a near-perfect match. It would have told investigators that the killer of Sara Yarborough was a first-degree relative of Edward Nicholas. But the state's crime labs were buried under a backlog of thousands of rape kits, and the legislative will to implement familial searching was stuck on the back burner. When Anne Croney was finally contacted by detectives in 2019 and told that her attacker from 83 was the man who had murdered Sara, she was devastated. She had lived her life thinking she had just escaped an assault. She didn't realize she had escaped a killer. Her outrage was directed squarely at the system that had allowed Nicholas to serve less than half of his sentence for the attack on her. The system failed, she said. It really failed. He should have been locked up. It is one of the most agonizing aspects of this case. Patrick Nicholas was right there. He was in their hands in 83. He was in their hands in 93. His own brother was in the system in 2005. Every single time, a loophole or a policy decision allowed him to remain a shadow. What do you think? When a predator admits they have a problem with sexual violence, should they ever be allowed to plead down to a lesser charge? How many lives could have been saved if the law didn't allow these deals? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We need to talk about why these failures happen. As we move into the final acts of this story, we see how the undercover team finally cornered a man who had spent his life dodging the consequences of his actions. They were no longer following a lead. They were following a man who had been free for 30 years because the law had failed to look in its own backyard. The boogeyman was finally about to run out of places to hide. By September 27, 2019, the atmosphere inside the King County Sheriff's Office had shifted from the usual hum of daily business to a state of electric focus. Detective Kathleen Decker, who had taken over the lead on Sara's case, received a phone call from Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick that would change the course of Pacific Northwest history. The genealogical team hadn't just found a lead, they had arrived at a single, definitive name, Patrick Leon Nicholas. After nearly 28 years of chasing ghosts and sketches, the investigators finally had a target. But they knew that a genealogical chart isn't a pair of handcuffs. They needed a direct, physical match between the man living in Covington and the biological evidence stored in a lab freezer since 1991. The plan was as simple as it was dangerous. They couldn't just knock on his door and ask for a swab. A man with Nicholas's history might flee or destroy evidence if he knew the net was closing. Instead, they initiated a round-the-clock surveillance operation beginning on September 29. A team of undercover detectives began trailing the 55-year-old through the mundane rhythms of his life. They watched him leave his dilapidated home on a large, overgrown property in Covington, a place that neighbors described as unsettling and out of place. They followed him as he boarded the bus, the same mode of transport he had used for decades, likely passing the high school where Sara's life had ended every single day. The detectives observed a man who lived on the extreme fringes of society. He had no children, no visitors, and seemingly no friends. He was a loner in the truest sense of the word, a predator who had spent nearly 30 years hiding in plain sight by becoming invisible. As they followed him, the weight of the case sat heavy on their shoulders. This was for the girl with the red hair. This was for the two boys who had looked into those eyes in 1991. The team was determined that this time he wouldn't get away. The breakthrough happened on a typical Sunday afternoon in Kent, Washington. Nicholas had traveled to a strip mall area where he frequented a laundromat and a nearby sports bar. The undercover team was positioned nearby, their eyes never leaving him. Nicholas stepped outside the business to smoke. In the world of forensic science, this is known as abandoned DNA. When a suspect discards an item in a public place, it becomes fair game for law enforcement. They watched him light up a cigarette, the smoke curling into the grey Washington afternoon. He finished it and flicked the butt onto the pavement. Then he lit a second one. The tension in the surveillance vehicles must have been suffocating. One cigarette butt might be contaminated or damaged. Two would be a windfall. As he finished the second cigarette and tossed it aside, Nicholas reached into his pocket and accidentally dropped a crumpled paper napkin. He didn't notice. He turned and walked back inside, leaving his genetic blueprint lying on the cold concrete. The moment he was out of sight, a detective moved with practiced speed. They retrieved the 2 cigarette butts and the napkin, sealing them into evidence bags as if they were made of priceless glass. The items were rushed to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Scientist Jody Sass, who had been working on Sara's evidence since she was a young analyst in the early 90s, was now the one to handle this final, crucial test. On Wednesday, October 2, 2019, the results were finalized. The DNA from the cigarette butt was compared to the semen profile from Sara's clothing. It wasn't just a close call, it was a perfect match. The lab determined that the probability of the DNA belonging to any other unrelated person in the United States was 1 in 120 quadrillion. To put that in perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on the entire planet. The science was absolute. Patrick Leon Nicholas was the man from the bushes. The arrest came the following evening, October 3, 2019. Undercover officers located Nicholas at Nashville's Sports Bar and Grill in downtown Kent. They moved in quickly, taking him into custody without incident. For the patrons in the bar, it was a sudden disruption of their happy hour. For the detectives, it was the end of a 28-year marathon. Nicholas was booked into the King County Jail with bail set at $5 million. But the most revealing moment was still to come. Inside the interrogation room, detectives sat across from the man who had been the boogeyman of Federal Way for 3 decades. Nicholas was calm, almost detached. He played the part of the confused citizen, claiming he had no clue why he was being questioned. He asked what he was being charged with, still trying to maintain his mask of innocence. The lead detective looked him in the eye and told him they were investigating a homicide from 1991, the death of a 16-year-old girl named Sara. In that moment, the mask slipped. Nicholas didn't ask, "Who is Sara?" or "What are you talking about?" Instead, he leaned forward and asked a question that sent a wave of alarm through the room. What year was this? It was a question that spoke volumes. To the investigators, it didn't sound like the question of an innocent man. It sounded like the question of someone who had a mental list of dates and victims, someone who needed to know which specific crime had finally caught up to him. He realized his mistake almost immediately. After roughly 90 minutes of dancing around the truth, he asked for an attorney and stopped talking, but it was too late. Between the 1 in a quadrillion DNA match and that single incriminating question about the year, the shadow that had hung over Federal Way since 1991 was finally being pulled into the light. The boogeyman was no longer a sketch on a school bulletin board. He was a prisoner in a jumpsuit, and the family of Sara Yarborough was about to get the phone call they had been waiting for since the morning they lost their daughter. Justice had been delayed by loopholes and limited technology, but it was no longer going to be denied. By the spring of 2023, the hallway outside Courtroom 4D at the Maleng Regional Justice Center in Kent, Washington, was thick with a heavy, decades-old anticipation. It had been 31 years, 4 months, and 9 days since Sara Yarborough's life was taken on a frozen hillside. Inside the room, the man accused of the crime sat at the defense table. At 59 years old, Patrick Leon Nicholas didn't look like the boogeyman that had haunted the community's nightmares for a generation. He wore a blue sweater and glasses, his head mostly bald, looking more like a quiet grandfather than a predator who had spent his life navigating the shadows. But for the Yarborough family and the detectives who had never stopped hunting him, the mask of age was irrelevant. They were there to see the truth finally written into the public record. The trial was a collision between the old world of 1991 and the high-tech reality of 2023. King County Senior Deputy Prosecutor Mary Barbosa and Celia Lee laid out a case built on the bedrock of modern genomics. They reminded the jury that while the detective work had been exhaustive, involving over 4,000 tips and hundreds of DNA swabs, the answer had always been hidden in the biological evidence Sara had fought to leave behind. Forensic scientist Jody Sass, who had been a young analyst when the case first landed on her desk in the early 90s, took the stand to explain the numbers. The DNA found under Sara's fingernails and on her clothing was a near-perfect map of Patrick Nicholas's genetic code. The prosecution didn't just present a match, they presented a statistical impossibility of innocence. They told the jury that the odds of the DNA belonging to any other unrelated person in the United States were 1 in 120 quadrillion. To put that in perspective, you would have to search through millions of Earths to find another person with that specific signature. But the state's case wasn't just about laboratory slides and mathematical probabilities. It was about the tangible, unsettling evidence found inside Nicholas's home in Covington during his arrest. Detectives had uncovered a kitchen drawer that felt like a trophy room for a man stuck in the past. Inside, they found a yellowed copy of a 1994 newspaper with an article about Sara's murder. Tucked away nearby was a photo of a cheerleader torn from a magazine, a silent, haunting echo of the predatory urges Nicholas had admitted to decades earlier. For the prosecution, these weren't coincidences. They were the mementos of a killer who had spent 28 years reliving his crime, while the rest of the world tried to forget it. The emotional peak of the trial arrived when the doors opened for the man who had seen the killer's face in the brush. Drew Miller was no longer the 13-year-old boy on a skateboard. He was a grown man. But as he looked across the room at Patrick Nicholas, the years seemed to vanish. He testified about that freezing morning, about the sound of breaking ice, and about the moment a man in a trench coat stood up from the bushes and stared. Miller told the jury that those evil eyes were something he could never unsee. Even after 3 decades, he recognized the gaze of the man who had walked away from Sara's body. The defense attorney, David Montes, tried to dismantle this testimony by pointing to the original 1991 sketches. He argued that the witnesses back then described a man with a face marked by acne or pockmarks, while Nicholas had always had clear skin. He claimed the police were so desperate for an answer that they turned to wacky technology and a genealogical hobbyist to find a scapegoat. But the jury saw through the Rorschach test of the sketches, focusing instead on the undeniable reality of the DNA. Another survivor, Anne Croney, traveled from out of state to face the man who had held a knife to her throat in 1983. Her testimony provided the jury with a window into Nicholas's signature style, his habit of approaching women near their cars, starting a conversation to disarm them, and then forcing them into secluded areas. Her story was a bridge between his past crimes and the savage attack on Sara. She reminded the courtroom that Nicholas wasn't a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had been practicing his violence for years. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. On May 10th, 2023, the room went silent as the clerk began reading the findings. The first verdict was not guilty for premeditated first-degree murder, a brief moment of tension that sent a shock through the Yarborough family. But then came the rest. Nicholas was found guilty of felony first-degree murder and second-degree murder. Crucially, the jury returned a special verdict finding that the crimes were sexually motivated. This finding was the key that allowed the judge to move beyond standard sentencing ranges and ensure that Nicholas would never see the outside of a prison cell again. Sara's childhood friend, Mary Beth Thome, described the tremendous sense of relief that washed over the room. The long wait for accountability was finally over. 2 weeks later, on May 25th, the sentencing hearing began. It was a morning defined by the voices of the living. Andrew Yarborough, Sara's younger brother, stood before the court and shared a memory that had defined his childhood. He spoke about being 11 years old and lying in bed, listening to the sounds of his parents crying through the walls at night. He described the vivid pain in his father's voice during that first phone call and told the judge that Nicholas does not belong in a free society because he lacks the ability to feel remorse or basic human emotion. Sara's mother, Laura, spoke of the daughter who was the delight of her life. She looked at the judge and asked for the highest possible sentence, stating that while they would always pine for Sara, they wanted to ensure no other woman would ever have to face the monster sitting in that blue sweater. Judge Josephine Wiggs didn't hold back in her final remarks. She addressed the defense's argument that Nicholas's crimes were the result of a youthful brain. She told him, What I see here is not conduct that was a product of an undeveloped youthfulness. It speaks to a calculated, predatory, depraved brain. She then looked at the man who had evaded justice for nearly 30 years and said the words the community had been waiting for. There will be accountability, no matter how many years it takes. And today is that day. She sentenced Patrick Leon Nicholas to 548 months, 45 years and 8 months in prison. Given his age, it was a death sentence behind bars. He would be 105 years old before he was eligible for release. As Nicholas was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the shadow that had hung over Federal Way since 1991 finally began to lift. The boogeyman was gone. For the Yarborough family, there would never be a full closure. Sara was still missing from their holiday tables and their family photos, but there was finally peace. The truth had been spoken, the evidence had been validated, and the man with the evil eyes was exactly where he belonged. The 30-year quest for justice had reached its end, proving that even when the legal system fails, the truth has a way of staying alive in the blood. The silence that returned to courtroom 4D after Patrick Leon Nicholas was led away in chains wasn't the empty, hollow silence of 1991. It was the silence of a debt finally paid. For 31 years, the city of Federal Way had carried the weight of an unanswered question, a dark fog that had settled over the high school campus and never quite lifted. But as the Yarborough family walked out into the grey Washington afternoon following the sentencing, they weren't just carrying their grief anymore, they were carrying the truth. The man who had been a ghost for 3 decades was now just a number in the Department of Corrections, a predator whose timeline had finally hit a dead end. But the story of Sara Yarborough doesn't end with a prison cell. It continues in the hallways of the school she loved and in the very laws that govern how we hunt for monsters. If you visit Federal Way High School today, you will find a place anchored by a specific kind of memory. Tucked away on the campus is a memorial bench, a permanent fixture that serves as a sanctuary for those who still feel the sting of her absence. It isn't just a slab of stone, it is a collection of the things that defined her. Carved into the memorial are her backpack, her favorite books, a pair of ballet slippers, and a small dog sitting faithfully by her side. At the center of it all are 2 simple, powerful words: Carpe diem, seize the day. For Sara's mother, Laura, that motto is a bittersweet reminder of the vibrant girl who was always rushing, always smiling, and always planning for a future that was supposed to take her far beyond the borders of Washington state. At the sentencing, Laura spoke about the mother-daughter relationship being something unique and irreplaceable. She told the court that Sara was the delight of her life, and that the family had been irrevocably changed by the violence of that December morning. She made it clear that while the verdict brought a sense of legal finality, it would never stop the pining for Sara that happens every time a holiday table has an empty chair or a red-headed girl walks past on the street. Andrew Yarborough, who was only 11 years old when his world was shattered, provided one of the most haunting windows into the collateral damage of this crime. He spoke of the vivid pain in his father Tom's voice during that first phone call, a sound that stayed with him through every year of his life. He described the trauma of growing up in a house where the sound of parents crying through the walls at night was the soundtrack of his childhood. Andrew's statement was a powerful indictment of the man in the blue sweater, stating that Nicholas does not belong in a free society because he lacks the basic human ability to feel remorse. For Andrew, the legacy of his sister is found in the strength it took to face the boogeyman and watch him finally lose his freedom. Beyond the personal grief, this case has fundamentally transformed the landscape of American forensic science. The Sara Yarborough homicide is now studied in universities and police academies as the investigative miracle that proved the power of the blood. It was the first case in history to successfully use direct-to-consumer DNA data to generate a lead that solved a cold hit. It bridged the gap between the 17th century and the 21st, using a family tree that began on the Mayflower to catch a killer in a laundromat. In 2022, the investigation was honored as the DNA Hit of the Year, a global recognition of the detectives and scientists who refused to let the fire go out. But with that recognition came a difficult conversation about the database loopholes that allowed a serial rapist to walk free for so long. The Yarborough case became the primary evidence for why our legal system needs to catch up to our technology. Investigators like Kathy Decker and Tom Jensen have used Sara's story to advocate for massive policy shifts in Washington. They pointed to the fact that Nicholas's brother was in the system in 2005, and if the state had allowed familial searching back then, Sara's killer would have been caught 14 years earlier. Because of this case, there is a renewed, urgent push for Sara's law legislation aimed at making retroactive DNA collection mandatory for every person convicted of a violent offense or a sex crime, regardless of when their conviction happened. The goal is simple: to ensure that no other family has to wait 10,000 days for a name. Sara's childhood friends, like Mary Beth Thome, have spent their adult lives ensuring that Sara is remembered for how she lived, not just how she died. Mary Beth spoke of Sara as a beautiful person who was smart, feisty, and imaginative. She reminded the community that, in taking Sara, the killer took the innocence of every student who attended that school in '91. The tremendous sense of relief that washed over her during the guilty verdict was a reflection of an entire generation of Federal Way residents who could finally exhale. For them, the legacy of the case is a reminder that the truth is patient, and justice, while sometimes slow, is relentless. The final message of this investigation was perhaps best summarized by King County Council member Pete von Reichbauer during a press conference following the arrest. He looked at the cameras and sent a message that echoed across the state. "If you are a victim in King County, we will not forget you. And if you are an offender in King County, we will not forgive you." The Sara Yarborough case is the living proof of that promise. It is a story of a 13-year-old boy who never forgot the evil eyes in the bushes. It is a story of a lab analyst who spent 30 years rushing results for a girl she never met. And it is the story of a family whose love was stronger than the decades of silence. Thank you for spending time with us today at Cold Cases Files. The journey to find Sara's killer reminds us that no shadow is deep enough to hide the truth forever. If you haven't already, please subscribe and share this video. Your support is the reason we can continue to tell these stories of persistence and accountability. What other cases do you believe are just one DNA match away from being solved? Let us know in the comments below, and we will see you in the next investigation.